The Borderlands franchise of post-apocalyptic games is notoriously known for its looter-shooter gameplay, wacky characters, cel-shaded comic book art direction, and unashamed cringy approach to narrative writing. These games are like drinking a gallon of Red Bull and taking LSD at the same time, but please don't recreate this metaphor yourself, or at least blame me for the outcome. These games are complete and utter insanity, and all of the most outrageous, hilarious, and entertaining ways a first-person shooter can be. While these characteristics are present throughout all entries in the series to some extent, the original Borderlands is the one game in the series that I found that is vastly different in terms of tone and approach when compared to other mainline entries. The original is arguably the least popular and played of the bunch while having a very different approach to presenting itself as a post-apocalyptic game. These differences are what I found that I enjoyed most about this game when comparing it to other entries in the series. Despite being the least popular and mostly forgotten game in the franchise, acting as its own time capsule of late 2000s game design, it still holds a place in my gaming experiences and one that I will remember for a very long time. When looking at the favorite child amongst fans, Borderlands 2, it seemed to nail everything that the original set out to do. The story was solid, the gameplay turned the dial to 11, the loot was even more wacky and over the top, and of course, Handsome Jack stole the show and is still recognized as one of gaming's greatest villains. Subsequent games were more akin to Borderlands 2 than the original, and it's not too much of a stretch to say that the franchise owes much of its relevance in gaming culture to Borderlands 2 over any other entry in the series. Despite the impressive merits and experience of Borderlands 2, there are some aspects of the Borderlands formula that have not been improved upon or implemented since the release of Borderlands 1 in October 20th of 2009. Borderlands 1 excels at demonstrating the atmosphere of the wasteland, the sense of isolation in a forgotten world, and corporate greed as driving narrative and gameplay experiences for the player that no other game in the series has been able to measure up to since. Before I get into the specifics of the game, I want to take some time to explain who I am. I'm known as Level T here on YouTube. Just like you, I love video games. In my view, among countless video game analysts and essayists, video games should be regarded as revolutionary, sacred, and valuable expressions of the human condition that can be felt and experienced by anyone. To me, they're on the same playing field as books, art, film, plays, music, etc. As I've grown older, I've begun to notice and better appreciate how video games are becoming more established and taken seriously in popular culture as vessels of meaning and human experience. The vast expanse of YouTube video essayists analyzing games really hammers that notion home. The fact that there is this corner of YouTube dedicated to analyzing games in this manner not only makes me feel validated as someone who simply enjoys games, but also adds this whole new layer of depth to my gaming experiences. It's such a cool thing to hear someone's take on a game that I would have never considered or saw in my playthrough, so I hope this video can offer some of those feelings for you. I am all for playing the role of devil's advocate or looking for something nobody has really mentioned, so I look forward to expanding on that mission with future content on this channel. Anyways, let's get into why the ugly duckling of the Borderlands series deserves a bit of love. My initial experience with Borderlands 1 was shortly after it launched back in 2009 with a generally fun time playing alone and with friends at the time. I thought it was a good game, but nothing I would rank as part of my must-play list. It was a fun, fresh approach with this new concept of being proclaimed as looter-shooter type experience with the famously advertised bazillion guns that got my and others' attention. Since my initial playthrough, I haven't touched the game until early 2023 of this year. Fast forward all those years, I'm very surprised to say my opinions have changed in a more favorable light towards this game, especially in the narrative and atmosphere department. Despite there being a lack of a concrete, in-your-face narrative with prominent dialogue and interesting side quests, I would say that's what makes this game so great. Looking at the game now in 2023 has made me appreciate that difference in how the story was told, or was more or less left to the player to find meaning for themselves. I had always thought that Borderlands 2 and Borderlands 3 to be superior games in many ways, but playing the original this year opened my eyes to some concepts that flew under the radar my first time around. These concepts being that the thematic tone of the main game, atmosphere, and storytelling highlight the idea of being in a believable wasteland much greater than any other game in the series. Essentially, the wasteland plays a crucial role in the game's narrative presentation, player progression and experience, and functions as a driving force that affects the world and what goes on within it. The wasteland of Pandora, in my view, does not have this same power or influence seen in Borderlands 1 at any other point in the mainline series of games to the same magnitude or extent. Even though this is supposed to be a post-apocalyptic series of games, Only the original game effectively utilizes it as a setting and narrative theme as part of the experience in a persistent and, to my surprise and excitement, successful way. By comparison, Borderlands 2 really wanted to tell a more cinematic story, and that's fine, but I found the Wasteland to be more of a backdrop to carry over the art style than an actual influence on the narrative besides the idea of establishing order to a quote, savage land. The Wasteland was only highlighted as a place that needed saving and not an effective driver of narrative character action and overall atmosphere within the player experience. Funny enough, that concept was already done before Borderlands 2 with the Secret Armory of General Knox DLC found in Borderlands 1 years prior. Lack of Wasteland themes and storytelling is even more noticeable in Borderlands 3 because the player found themselves traveling off Pandora to other planets, removing the sense of isolation, mystery, and the theme of corporate greed from the gameplay experience. The player was only on Pandora for a small fraction of the game, and the other planets they traveled to lacked the Wasteland aesthetic and narrative driving force. The pre-sequel was on Pandora's moon Elpis, which didn't highlight any Wasteland aesthetics visually or narratively, and it looks like Wonderlands is in the same boat as Borderlands 3 with the medieval fantasy coat of paint. I haven't played Wonderlands at the time of this video, so maybe that assumption will change in the future. I also haven't played the Tales from the Borderlands games either, so when I get to them, I hope they at least offer a fraction of the Wasteland storytelling and atmosphere as shown in Borderlands 1. As of now, I only see the Wasteland playing a large role in the narrative and player experience in Borderlands 1, making it the most unique and interesting game in the series in my view at this time. All of this is to say that I don't think that Borderlands 1 is the best game in this series overall, but rather it delivers something unique that the others don't. It took me on my second go-around and years between those playthroughs to grasp just how different this game felt in comparison to the other entries. Of course, the original was doing a bit of trend chasing at the time in terms of tone and visual color palette, but besides the side effects of being made in late 2000s, Borderlands 1 feels and treats the experience like a true post-apocalyptic wasteland. Somewhere in the development of future titles, that aspect of the experience was lost in favor of a much more cinematic narrative that serves to cater to a wider audience. I'm all for change, experimentation, and wanting to reach a wider audience, but the original Borderlands absolutely nailed the atmosphere and storytelling of the Wasteland more than any other in the franchise. So let's get into some of the main reasons why. Starting with the visual presentation of the game, the environment of Borderlands 1 is an absolute dump. There's trash everywhere, dilapidated mining and equipment facilities, and shantytowns of bandits and settlers. The people in the world are a discarded mess. The unique cel-shaded art style highlights the creases of trash, indentations of rusted metal, and the scarce rivets holding everything together. There's nothing quite like looking out at the open plain to see the jagged mountain formations and slowly churning windmills. The Wasteland is not highlighted as strongly as it is here in the series. Whether it was budget or hardware limitations of the time, the environments are more empty. Intentional or not, the Wasteland of Pandora visually looks abandoned. It's not a typical empty expanse of nothing, but a broken and scarred land that has been trying to repair and patch itself together with the scraps of corporate greed. The landscape is littered with these remnants more so here than any other game in the series. The lack of variety of environments highlights this notion further to show that there is no part of this planet that has gone unscathed. The main game playthrough of Borderlands 1 sees the player trudging from one abandoned trash heap to the next with little to no change in between. The planet has been stripped of its resources and then discarded, which is something that is not visually represented as well in later entries in the series. By comparison, the sheer variety and color palette of the environments is nice in Borderlands 2, but it does not highlight Pandora as an unforgiving wasteland the same way the original game does. The trash and remnants of the corporations that have bled the planet dry of resources are not present in the sequels. We instead get cities, the tundra, and the highlands, just to name a few. There are some locations within Borderlands 2, such as the dust, that can evoke similar atmospheric callbacks to the wasteland, but those are only a fraction of the gaming experience. Borderlands 2 takes us back to the small town of Firestone of Borderlands 1 towards the later half of the game, but by then the location is more of a nostalgia bait rather than an effort to represent the wasteland aesthetic and atmosphere. The sand in the recreation is brighter, the sky is bluer, and the trash somehow looks more neat and organized. Despite the changes to the original starting area of Borderlands 1 and this brief jaunt found in Borderlands 2, I will admit this was one of my favorite moments of my first playthrough of the sequel. Borderlands 1 holds the wasteland aesthetic front and center with the spread of locations save for the very last push towards the vault in the snowy mountains that marks the only drastic visual shift in the environment. Borderlands 1 is monotonous in terms of environmental variety, and whether or not that is due to hardware, budget limitations, or intentional environmental storytelling, it still reinforces the emptiness, loneliness, and hopelessness of Pandora. It makes the player think, how the hell is there anything of value in this dump? The game doesn't make a point to tell you the player is in a wasteland beyond the opening cutscene. The later titles do more telling than showing that these games are set in a post-apocalyptic world. Visuals of the environments you traverse through show that for you in Borderlands 1, from Firestone, the Trash Coast, to Crazy Earl's Scrapyard, the environmental repetition only reinforces remnants of corporate greed, isolation, and emptiness of life and hope in the wasteland. Maybe the increased budget on future titles was to the post-apocalyptic environmental storytelling's detriment, but here in Borderlands 1's interpretation of Pandora, it is highlighted expertly whether it was intentional or not, due in part to the development process. This is all to say that the less is more approach works better to feed into the wasteland atmosphere. Following the visual presentation, the wasteland's indifference to you as the player highlights the post-apocalyptic narrative effectively. The desert of Borderlands 1 is an unforgiving place where the player spends most of their time interacting with and navigating. Contributing to the unforgiving nature, the wildlife, locals, and environment itself are indifferent to your arrival. You as the player are no superhero or special cut of cloth like later games would make you believe. I'm a huge fan of games that don't make you feel special rather than ones that insist on how great you are all the time throughout the gameplay experience. The worlds within games that act indifferent to the player tend to yield a greater sense of accomplishment, growth, and development. In other words, games like these push you to become better because there simply is no other choice. Here on Pandora, as interpreted in Borderlands 1, you are but another fool in search of some value that's not believed to be here in the first place. You are a dumb treasure hunter who is chasing stories and meaningless dreams. As a response to your ignorance of this quest, the wasteland doesn't forgive, it easily forgets. Sooner or later, the wasteland will have you, the player, among its piles of wreckage. The local population conveys this indifference to the player the most overtly because here, more than any other entry in the series, they act more believable as people living in a wasteland environment. Those who inhabit the landscape share the same qualities that exhibit the wasteland narrative atmosphere through their actions and words towards the player. The locals of Pandora simply use you for their own survival. You as a player are a means to an end. For example, Zed, Firestone's lone citizen and doctor, offers you his medical services if you evict the bandits from the town that are causing him trouble. This simple exchange of favors is the first interaction in the game, setting up the idea that if you help people along your journey to the vault, they will most likely help you. Most likely, the player wouldn't help Zed unless they had something valuable for them. In this example, Zed benefits more from this wasteland-esque agreement. Upon completion of this task, you gain access to his medical vending machines throughout the game, spending your money on his medical and shield products throughout the journey. He essentially profits exponentially from that one small favor you did for him at the start of the game. For the rest of the game beyond the first area of Firestone, you don't directly interact with him that much. Essentially, he was saved by you and gained a new customer in the process. Clearing out the locals isn't that much of a fair trade when you really think about it. The same unfair trade of labor goes for Scooter, the mechanic for all the Outrunner vehicles the player uses to speedily traverse the landscape. If you get his catch-a-ride station working for him as part of an early quest, you get to drive around in his custom-built vehicles. That's free advertising for his business, and as a result, it's no surprise that in Borderlands 1 specifically, you see the bandits driving the same vehicles as you. In later games, they would drive different special bandit vehicles that the player does not have access to from the catch-a-ride station until later in the game. To him, you are just another customer who's going to look really cool speeding off into the Pandoran sunset or making the jump over Piss-Wash Gully. Scooter doesn't seem to be concerned with money like other characters might, but he does value his art through his creation of his vehicles. If more people drive them, bandits or vault hunters, that's putting his art on display for a wider audience to see. While you might be allies as the story progresses, you are still doing his dirty work through his side quests. His quests often involve getting parts for his vehicles, finding food, alcohol, and explicit magazines that are clearly meant for greater purposes. He's not much of a fighter, so using you to get the things he needs that would otherwise be treacherous for him in exchange for his vehicle service highlights the wasteland exchange between survivors. He is the typical wasteland mechanic here more than what he is made out to be in Borderlands 2. There he is more of a hopeless romantic and satire device for hillbilly culture and comedy. While one can argue he is a more developed character in 2, he really isn't acting in line with the wasteland narrative. Marcus is an even more glaring and consistent example of this survival for self-interest relationship between the player and the characters. Marcus constantly wants to be your partner in sharing the wealth of the vault as you get closer and closer to reaching its gate. He also promotes his vending machines like Zed that sell guns. He sells guns to you, the bandits, or anyone who needs some firepower. You are just another customer to him. I would argue that he is the only character in the series that stays consistent with this unforgiving wasteland form of conduct in the follow-up games. I found him to be one of the few characters that still acts like he is looking out for himself primarily. Many characters like Zed and Scooter are much more selfless and willing to lend a hand due to the common goal narrative in follow-up games. Patricia Tannis, the lead scientist studying the vault on Pandora, underwent a character overhaul from Borderlands 1 and onward, similar to Scooter and Zed. In Borderlands 1, she attempts to double-cross you by selling you out to the Atlas Corporation in order to save her own skin and get Commandant Steele off her back. Like the previous characters, this brief and quickly forgiven betrayal is the Wasteland's way of showing that there are next to no inhabitants that do not see you as disposable. Beyond basic video game mechanics of task and reward, the interactions with other characters and quest givers during the main story playthrough highlight that exchange of favors is the common language spoken throughout the Wasteland. Just like you, the locals are simply trying to survive, and if someone like you comes along, they're going to find ways to use you for their own gain. In Borderlands 1, the characters don't grovel at your feet like later entries and treat you like a messiah or savior. In Borderlands 1's interpretation of the Wasteland way of life, you aren't the mega badass vault hunter as depicted in sequential entries in the series. In Borderlands 2, everyone must work together to stop Handsome Jack, and in Borderlands 3, everyone is on the same page of fighting against the Calypso twins. In short, the characters themselves act more in line with the atmosphere of the game setting of the Wasteland in Borderlands 1 than any other entry in the series. The recurring characters in Borderlands 2 and 3 are all united under a common goal, removing the Wasteland way of survival. With everyone on the same team, there is a greater need to be a bit more cooperative and selfless in order to stop the threats of the villains from both games. In Borderlands 1, the common goal is survival, but the characters are using their skills to benefit themselves primarily over the player. They are more in line with the behavior and actions needed to survive a harsh wasteland rather than going to war with a rival faction. The notion of corporate greed is commonly referenced and shown throughout the gameplay experience of Borderlands 1. There are so many machines, facilities, and people left behind by the corporations that sought to extract Pandora's resources or were in search of the vault themselves. The bandits that we fight throughout the game were laborers that once worked under corporations like Dahl. While this bit of lore is hinted at in Borderlands 2, there is a lack of follow-up narrative and visual storytelling on this correlation between the enemies we fight and their purpose for being on the planet to begin with. In Borderlands 1, we likely see them hanging around old work camps more so than making makeshift camps like some kind of nomadic tribe. They're more linked with the lives they once had here because they're using the wreckage of their former occupations to survive the wasteland. In Borderlands 1, they still haven't reached the stage of truly settling on Pandora. Here in Borderlands 1, they still cling tightly to the remnants of these facilities. Perhaps it's because they hope their former employers will still return for them. While there are instances like the Dahl Dam in Borderlands 2, I found that most bandit camps visually look like they made themselves rather than using the facilities themselves as shelter. The idea that we are fighting former prison laborers throughout the game can be a heartbreaking realization. When loitering a distance from the bandits, they begin telling us to get lost and start to threaten the player, showing us that they do not want to fight initially. If left alone, they will often not come after the player and will simply go about their lives. This may not be the case for every single encounter in the game, but I found the bandits to be much more docile when compared to their interactions in later games. In the follow-up games, they sort of just charge at the player, especially in Borderlands 3. They'll say funny things to highlight that they have all become crazy, but I found that was more for the humor rather than showcasing the fact that these were once people who were taken advantage of and left behind by corporate greed. The darker and more subdued dialogue with the bandits in Borderlands 1 shows that they do not want to be messed with and want to live in peace. Initiating combat towards them is the last thing that they want, but they will at least eat you if they survive the encounter, as noted in their combat dialogue. Bandits in later games just want to go after you for the sport of it, and they only seem to change tune when you gun down one of their friends in front of them, which will then be followed by dialogue meant to suggest they wanted to kill them and you just beat them to the punch. The dialogue can be varied, but 9 times out of 10 it is done for the sake of humor rather than highlighting the pain and trauma these bandits have been through while being stuck on Pandora. To add to this dynamic, I found the aggro range of the bandits to be far smaller in Borderlands 1, meaning that you can get closer to them without triggering their combat towards you. This all adds to the notion that you, the player, might be the real problem and not the bandits. As the player, you come charging in and just blow these bandits away for the quest giver. This is fueled by your obsession with the loot they may have or for the simple satisfaction of showing off your shiny new gun or skill. Many times you have to initiate combat first, which puts you as the instigator, something that doesn't take place in later titles. This gave me a real sense that I was encroaching on them and their way of life, and that they were more afraid of me than I was of them. I didn't feel like I was cleansing Pandora of violence, but instead I was feeding it. Here I was the one shooting first and beginning the combat a large majority of the time. Yes, I'm aware the bandits do horrible things to the local population in all the games, but their hesitancy in Borderlands 1 indicates to me that they see the player character as a threat and someone they do not want to mess with. Bandits in later games rush the player in an attempt to highlight how insane they have become, and there's a fair argument to be had there that given the time that has passed from the first game, the bandits have only gotten crazier. However, the bandits of the first game showcase a much different and more complex kind of insanity. This is the kind that's trying to wrestle with who they once were and who they are now. They were left behind and discarded like the machinery they once operated. It's all incredibly dark, but highlights the wasteland in a much more authentic way in my view. The Borderlands 1's portrayal of bandits is not obscured by humor, but instead demonstrated through their isolation, depression, and hopelessness. They act in accordance to a much more believable and dark kind of wasteland, a type of wasteland that resonated with me much more. Patricia Tannis is the character that we spend the most time learning about in our quest to locate the vault and gather the vault key fragments. She is also the most fleshed out and representative character of the themes of corporate greed shown throughout the game, further driving the wasteland atmosphere. She is a former scientist that worked for the Doll Corporation in search of the vault. The corporation left her stranded on Pandora, and throughout our playthrough we recover her lost echo logs to piece together what happened to her all this time upon meeting her in the later half of the game. We only get fragments or pieces of her story throughout the ecologues, which further enhances her mystery and the planet's mystery. Her brief 1 to 2 minute recordings only offer a sliver of her experience. From these small pieces, we as the player can only imagine the full picture of her slow decline into insanity. Listening to her recall her research crew getting killed one by bandits and wildlife shows how she lost her connections to other people. She savored her last interaction with one of her fellow researchers as they died. Instead of attempting to console her associate in her final moments, she decided to use this as a marker of her social life that would most likely not be attained again, at least until you, the player, find her alone in her research camp. Her story is a sad and grueling tale of life on Pandora. She, like the bandits, lost everything and was broken as a result of the ruthless corporation that she worked for. The sole motivator for her continued survival alone is the vault and the wealth it might bring. To her, finding the vault is not for the treasure, but to simply prove that she was right all along. I have never quite decided if she was proving something to herself or the corporation that left her behind. It's a nice bit of narrative ambiguity that I really appreciate. She herself was an ambiguous character that was just as crazy as you for looking for the vault. Tannis never hints at her full intentions of her research. Finding all her ecologues still leaves a lot left to the player's imagination in terms of her background and motives throughout the game. This mystery, depth, and sympathy to her character is in stark contrast to her behavior in later games. Like the bandits in later games, she is being crazy and acting goofy simply for the humor of the story. Much like many of the characters from the first game, she began to act less in line with someone who is in a post-apocalyptic setting. Her ecologues in Borderlands 2 tell the story of her being attacked by Handsome Jack and him taking the vault key from her. All the while she reflects on her musings about her relationship with the pair of chairs. Yes, she's completely lost her marbles, but the tone shift is so great to where the player is laughing at her hallucinations in regards to her relationship with these chairs. As a part of the psychological torture, one was sawed apart by Jack and his men. The player laughs at the sheer ridiculousness of her retelling of her torture and not the actual details of what Jack did to her mentally by taking the vault key from her. The key was likely the only thing that represented her immense intellect that she never doubted, her willingness to persevere, and the companionship she found in the Vault Hunters from the first game. The vault key was the trophy of her achievements, and that event of losing it is not as fleshed out as it could be. The corporate greed of Jack and Hyperion could have been highlighted better in this moment of storytelling, and it would have been a great instance of the savage nature of those who come to Pandora to find wealth and power. Her PTSD is clouded by humor, which makes for a less compelling character and vehicle for the wasteland tone and atmosphere in Borderlands 2. In Borderlands 1, she was a bit quirky, but only as a means of highlighting her isolation in the wasteland over time. She is the primary voice by which the player gets a sense of what Pandora is like for someone who is not a vault hunter. The citizens in New Haven don't have any dialogue, and other characters don't really seem to be fazed or affected by their life on Pandora. They have adopted a bleak acceptance as opposed to being drunk, high, or just saying weird things like in later games. Marcus is having a great time making a profit from you and the Bandits. Scooter is content to build cars for anyone. Zed is feeling some success and confidence knowing that even though he's not a real doctor, he still can serve the people of New Haven thanks to his vending machines and private practice. Tannis is the only character that has the wounds to share to the player, so seeing her as the primary characterization of the wasteland atmosphere dissolved in later entries further demonstrates that the characters in Borderlands 1 reflect the wasteland atmosphere and tone much more effectively. Just like the Bandits, she falls under the simple box of the wasteland aesthetic that is carried over for continuity's sake. It's an aesthetic that is further diluted from the first game in order to serve other purposes such as the display of humor and pop culture references. The attempt to make her more interesting by making her a siren in Borderlands 3 is a desperate attempt to recreate something unique and memorable that was already there in the original game. These characters in Borderlands 1 and their shifts in the series are great representatives of the wasteland tone and atmosphere and where it has gone. But it's important to take a closer look at the narrative path in which the player follows. By analyzing the narrative of Borderlands 1, there's a clear message it is trying to carry to the player that further invokes its ability to be the most effective game in the series at conveying the wasteland and its influence on the player experience. While the narrative was my biggest gripe on my original playthrough, this time around I found it to be the game's biggest proponent of the wasteland as a thematic device. I won't summarize every detail of the story beat or of the narrative here, but I will be covering aspects in areas that I found to be the most effective in demonstrating the wasteland's influence over the gameplay experience. My initial gripe with the story was its indirect delivery. There are little to no cutscenes, character dialogue, and instead opts for written quest logs. Reading these lengthy quest logs was not something that I was interested in due to my age, attention span, and expectations of games at that time. Years later, after playing games like Dark Souls that have indirect means of storytelling, I've appreciated the delivery in this game much more. I will try my best to refrain from saying that Borderlands 1 is the Dark Souls of the series. If you have yet to play that franchise, please be aware that if you do, every game you play after will somehow connect back to Dark Souls. It's a blessing and a curse that can't be undone. Moving back to Borderlands 1, the Dark Souls of the series, the element of mystery that I mentioned earlier really takes effect thanks to its indirect storytelling and feeding of information about the world and its inhabitants. You as the player get the choice to be as invested in the story as you want or not. The game doesn't spoon-feed exposition to you. While the idea of not fully understanding the story can be initially frustrating, I found that it added to the experience of the wasteland. The wasteland is a mysterious place, especially on a first playthrough. You as a foolish treasure hunter have no clear objective other than finding the vault and figuring out what's inside, and even that objective seems incredibly daunting on a horizon you can't make out. Later games would give you a villain to beat, making the goals much clearer and direct, all the while the vault is more of a side attraction to feed your acquisition of better gear and loot. This isn't to say that one means of storytelling is better than the other in a general sense, but I found that the indirect means of storytelling play into the wasteland tone and atmosphere much better and clearer. This mystery couples well with the unforgiving environment of the game. The people, wildlife, and the landscape itself are indifferent to you, so why should the narrative be any different? It holds your hand far less in order to make you feel lost and confused. It negates a clear objective or set of points to follow in order to keep you focused on simply surviving the wasteland and becoming more powerful. In short, you as the player are nothing special to this world, perfectly playing into the core wasteland storytelling themes. Later Borderlands games writing desperately wants you to feel like a powerful superhero that's here to save the day. You, like everyone else in the wasteland, are trying to survive. Your survival just happens to be a treasure hunt towards whatever may be lying in the vault. The sense of survival is only found in an overt manner in Borderlands 1, which is kind of a shame in my view. Since you as the player do not know what's in the vault on a first playthrough, it becomes this goal that no longer takes center stage. Without knowing what's in store, the player is left to other elements of the game and narrative to gravitate towards. The focus of the game comes down to getting more loot and growing the player character class. Sure, there are small goals like getting out of Firestone, getting to New Haven, stopping the Atlas Corporation, etc. But the main goal shifts to focus on surviving. Getting from point A to point B is the way to survive. Doing menial tasks for the locals such as clearing out wildlife, taking bounties, fixing broken equipment all lead the player to getting paid. When the player is paid, they can buy more gear, and as they're doing these tasks, they're hunting for more gear as well. The player is also gaining more experience with each completed task, which helps them level up and gain more skill points, increasing their adaptability to the wasteland. So what does this all say to the main narrative goal if it's not in the forefront of the player's mind every step of the way? It's about the journey one undertakes to get there, not the destination. Hokey metaphors aside, this notion could not be more true for any other game in the series. The main narrative beat that promotes this is the fact that the vault does not hold any fulfilling reward after all the time and effort it took to get there. The opening of the vault sees the player fighting the Destroyer as the final obstacle. The Destroyer is an alien being from another dimension that is vulnerable in the player's realm, putting it and the player on the same playing field. The fight itself is incredibly unsatisfying. It flails its tentacles while shooting projectiles at you from its body, while you take aim at its massive single eye. The design of the fight is not unique, and its generic visual aesthetic is capped off by its bland name, the Destroyer. The fight is anything but rewarding or visually captivating. It comes down to just shooting the eye while the player watches the massive health bar slowly creep down. After the final blow was dealt, my thoughts were, that's it? The vault opens and 5 red chests with rare loot with a small fraction that it might be actually useful for your character or playstyle shows up. This only adds insult to injury to the idea that I came all this way for nothing. What was all of this for? If you thought this was an elongated analysis of poor game design, then you are correct. It's an unsatisfying conclusion to a long trek through the wasteland to finally get here. Instead, I look back on how I was a level 1 in Firestone all those hours ago. I had barely a pistol and no character action skill. Now I'm armed to the teeth and level 30-ish with the crazy abilities that I have stacked to match an effective build that represents my playstyle. The character has become mine. Maybe this was the point. Maybe the growth along the way was the point. I had a blast making myself as powerful as possible. I never really cared about the vault that much. The progress was in itself a reward. Bringing the idea of the wasteland back into view, why would one expect anything less to find essentially nothing at the end of this journey? After all, the wasteland is an empty, unforgiving place, so why should this moment of reaching our supposed destination be any different? The unforgiving nature of the wasteland rears its head again in the form of an unsatisfying boss fight, potentially useless loot, and the overused trope of the meaning being that which we found along the way. How appropriate. We were fools to think that the vault had anything of value or that there was anything of value in the wasteland. Instead, we pillaged and conquered seemingly all for naught. There is one more element of the game's experience that I have left to address here, and that's the impact that this whole journey has left on the player. So we have reached the conclusion that the journey was greater than the destination. Great, but what impact does that have on the player and the wasteland theme? As the player, you have become the very thing you have sought to destroy. Recall what I said about the bandits and your disturbance of them earlier. You as the player are no better than the organizations like Dahl who abandoned their workers who became bandits. You as the player are no better than Atlas that sought to civilize the planet for their own greed and need for control of alien technology stemming from the vault. So what has been driving you all this way is not finding out what was in the vault, but your greed. Putting myself in these shoes, I played this game wanting to get stronger, get more guns, level up, make more money, and frankly carve a satisfying path of carnage in my way. I sought to take and take and take, even though I might have done some good deeds along the way for the inhabitants. It was all self-serving. There was no team by my side, no common goal villain, just me and the loot, and by loot I mean the crappy drops I got at the end. The characters we play would go on in later games to establish some sense of order in their own way or become part of the bandits themselves. They would go on to become part of the wasteland. They stayed on Pandora. Lilith, Brick, Mordecai, and Roland wouldn't return home, and instead they would let themselves become claimed by the wasteland with their various interests and causes to justify their actions in Borderlands 2 and 3. You as the player don't leave the wasteland unless you do not play the following titles. You as a player are driven by your own continued greed to play the sequels in the hopes of gaining different, even more effective powers, guns, and means of mayhem, which is something I think all these games do very well. As you play these games, ask yourself, how have I become part of Pandora's wasteland? How has the wasteland claimed me? How am I any better than the corporations that pillaged and ripped this planet apart in search of something that was never really there? The villains we fight in later games with clear objectives have their own selfish reasons to conquer and pillage. This time, you are the bandit or the one who is being encroached upon. From a certain point of view, Handsome Jack might be seen as the reincarnation of the player character from Borderlands 1. The idea of that being highlighted more clearly would have made for some interesting narrative dynamics in the sequel that could have easily changed my opinion on how the wasteland atmosphere carried over from the first game. Here in Borderlands 1, it is much more obvious and on the nose that the wasteland fooled you and made you believe that there could have been something value here for your own selfish reasons. This is why the characters treat you as such. This is why the narrative is structured the way it is, and this is why the world looks the way it looks. It has been pillaged, and pillaged over and over again. You just happen to be the most recent conqueror. Of course, the wasteland, as interpreted in Borderlands 1, does the most effective job of presenting this to the player. As a silly anecdote, the fact that Borderlands mostly exists as the forgotten entry or least played only adds to the idea that the game itself is its own form of wasteland. When we think of Borderlands, we often think of Borderlands 2 and onwards. After all, that's when the real craze and buzz around the game and the series took off to become the gaming media icon it is today. The fandom has largely left the game behind to the sands of the wasteland in search of grander storytelling, more exciting loot, a bazillion and a half more guns, laughs, and making something of the world that was introduced in the first game. In a strange poetic way, maybe Borderlands 1 should be left to exist on its own. After all, its vast differences make it all the more easy to see how it is the ugly duckling, but a game that truly shines and puts the player in a true narrative and introspective wasteland. Borderlands 1 is the only game that I found that effectively utilizes the wasteland as a place for storytelling and self-reflection through its gameplay, narrative, and messaging. Without this game, the franchise would not be where it is today. It had to start somewhere. Yes, it has some flaws when compared to later games, but it does some things that hopefully this video helped to affirm or helped you consider looking into or looking back on fondly. I want to use these final words to say thank you for taking the time to watch this video. This is something I'm looking to develop over time with greater production value and depth of analysis in a gradual manner, and try to stutter a little bit less. Your patience and interest to make it to the end of this video means a lot to me. If you have any suggestions for future videos or feedback, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. As far as the future of the channel goes, I'm looking to do this as often as I can given my schedule. Although I will never sacrifice quality for quantity, so try to think of me as someone like that cousin you love seeing a few times out of the year on holidays. I definitely don't want to overstay my welcome or cloud your feed with subpar content and ideas. The passion I have for analyzing games in this manner is something I want to grow and provide as much time to as I can. If you would like to drop a like, subscribe, or share this video with a friend or family member, I would greatly appreciate it. Your time is valuable, so using that time to check out this video is greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and I hope to see you in the next one. Take care.